one. I actually realized that I missed two other slides at the end of this, but so let's actually go over them. I'm going to make a quiz for variable names, and it's going to you have like a week to do it. So when you're supposed to be going over this particular lecture, do the quiz, try your best. It from I've used this quiz before, so it shouldn't be overly strenuous for most of you. It's just about variable names, what would make a useful variable name. I'd like to also point out these are the kind of keywords that you have in C++. There may not even be all of the keywords. I think it's most of the keywords though. So that's the C keywords. Notice there's a couple lines that I've removed. Auto and goto are keywords you should never ever ever use. A goto statement, if any of you have parents that are programmers, or you know anyone that's an old school programmer at all, ask them what a goto is and see them get just the rage that erupts in them when you say that you want to use a goto at some point in time. Seriously, they will be enraged, or they should be, because the goto statement means the goto statement effectively says go to whatever line I want to in my program. Go to line 80. Now, if you add two other lines above it, line 80 is no longer where you're supposed to be pointing, but you're still pointing to line 80. Go-to statements allow you to do some crazy things in your code, and you should avoid it at all costs. Same with the auto statement. Most of the other ones are perfectly fine, but go-tos are still around in C, and I strongly recommend against them. Okay, here's the C++ keywords. Yes, let's please memorize all of these. Yep. No, do not memorize all of these. That's the point. Look it up. When you don't know how to make an enumerated data type, look it up. If you don't know the name of this, look it up. You're not going to memorize most of this stuff. And what's the point of trying to memorize it? Just look it up. So there's some things you shouldn't try, although try is perfectly fine as a term that's up there. Um, but like go-tos, you shouldn't try it all. You shouldn't use it all. But most of these things, you can look it up when you need them. It's trying to memorize these terms or the keywords is not the same as understanding how to code something. When you actually get to code something and you want something like an enumerated data type, you can look up what the syntax is. Okay, so we're going to do a quick overview, and then we're going to cover some of this other stuff in more depth later. So, where we left off, we looked at formatting, and we said we always need a main method. Every single one of our programs need a main method. You could have a void at the front. I will often put an int at the front. And actually, I need to fix my code for the other code for this, and return something. The void or the int at the front is not going to make any difference to your code yet. It's just by convention whether a function returns something. We'll get to that soon. We always have a parentheses at the end of your function name. This is stuff that's going into your function. So we will have stuff going into, we may have stuff that goes into a particular function. We have stuff that goes out of the function when you were done. In this case, nothing is being returned from the function when we are done. That's why it says void. It's nothing. It is the void, right? There's nothing that's going to be returned from this function. My code that I wrote earlier should have an int in it. It's going to return some number. What's the number? It's going to be 0, but you could return something else. This is what goes into the function. That's what comes out of the function. We have curly braces saying where the start and the end of the function is. And all our functions have pretty much everything in the entire program that we write is called from the main method. I like the make supper analogy, but maybe you don't, but I'm going to go with it anyways. If I say every night I have to make supper, so my function, my main method is make supper, right? It is to make supper. Making supper is a very elaborate thing. It might involve multiple parts, multiple different courses. It might dip multiple different things to time. They're all part of making supper. So it might be put pot roast in the oven, or prepare the pot roast, put pot roast in the oven, do this, do that, like 4 or 5 different things. Each one of those things should be their own function, own algorithm that we put somewhere else. Your main method calls those different parts, like make supper involves preparing the pot roast, putting the pot roast in the oven, preparing the mashed potatoes, preparing this, like these various parts. Each one of those parts should be in their own section, and all the main method is doing is, in this case, or making supper is doing, is doing those various parts. You don't just cram everything into the main method. The main method has everything, but it calls other parts of the code. So the main method is the start, the be all and end all, the start and the end of your program, but it itself can call other stuff. Much like making mashed potatoes is not one step, it's actually elaborate. So you have you call some other code that does making the mashed potatoes, some other algorithm. Your main method always, but it's always a start and end of your program. Curly brace starting things, and then curly brace to end it. At the end of each line, you put a semicolon. If you forget the semicolon, you will be in good company. This is the most common mistake every single new programmer makes. It is ridiculously common to make, and you could stare at it for a while until you get really good at finding these things. So, end of the line, put a semicolon. Just by default, always put a semicolon. Much like end of a sentence, I always put a period. I know for text messages I shouldn't, but I always put a period, right? So, it in any individual instruction ends with a semicolon. So, when you want a new instruction, you put it on a new line, but the end of the instruction is actually indicated by the semicolon, not the new line. So, float A, if I forget the semicolon, it would be float A double B as one thing, and that makes no sense, right? Semicolon indicates the end of the line or the end of the instruction. Quite frankly, this formatting with the indentations and all this kind of stuff, putting things on new lines, makes no difference to the compiler. The compiler doesn't see it at all. All of these new lines, they're removed. It doesn't know that they exist. It's a series of instructions, one after the other. And so that is for you to be able to read your code. You putting in new lines, you putting you putting the right spacing, you putting in tabs, all those kinds of things are for you and myself and the TAs to be able to read your code. And if you don't think it's important, I will make this particular claim. If you give me crappy enough code, not little mistakes, but like the formatting is just garbage, I may not look at it. Now, for an assignment, we probably have to look at it, but for the labs or for any lab work or you're trying to ask me for help on something, I reserve the right to just ignore your code. If it's just truly garbage, not missing missing one new line or something, I don't care. That's fine, right? Some variable names are a little bit wonky, but that's fine. But if it's just you don't even try and it looks horrible, I'm going to ask you to fix it before I have a look at it. Why? Because just like chess, just like video games, just like playing basketball or anything like that, we're used to seeing and processing things via patterns. We're used to seeing this pattern on how you design your code. You have to get into the habit of practicing good coding practices, and that means making the formatting look correct. Okay, people really do take it extremely seriously. You will not get a job after if they ask for a code snippet and your code is badly formatted, they will not give you the interview. Period. I have turned down people for interviews for this reason myself, and I know my wife has as well, and I know a lot of other people that interview programmers and tech people will turn down people for bad variable names and bad coding formatting because other people have to read your code. Okay, this is for really bad cases. For little minor cases, we're not going to not read your code, but really excruciatingly bad cases, yeah, don't even bother, right? That's me being hard nosed about it. I don't want to scare anyone on this, but I want people to actually try their best to make sure that it looks right. So this gives you effectively the same results, right? Char A, char B, char C, char D. I personally, and I think most other programmers, would prefer having them on new lines. Every time I have a semicolon, I put a new line. Because I'm not good at finding semicolons as a human. I'm really good at parsing white space. We're pre-programmed, if you will, for parsing white space. We're really good at it. And so you're making sure that the syntax matches what you're trying to convey, matching the formatting so that it's easier for people to read your code. You also want a tab inside because it's indented if it's in the curly braces. It's in the main method, therefore it should be indented. You can put one tab in between. Now, tabs, some people will swear by not using the tab key at all, but instead inserting spaces. That is the more common thing nowadays. But then your tab key just puts in 4 spaces instead of a tab. So I want you to try something like this, just to see this is something unrelated to what we were doing before. Uh, but just because I want to see if this does involve a new variable and also algorithmic thinking. This is the very first piece of code I ever had to do, or I was asked to do in class. And I thought this was revolutionary for me, at least when I realized this, and I realized the 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 really the quirkiness or the interesting aspects of computer science. That it's not the syntax, it's not the writing of the code, it's the problem solving, it's the thinking through a problem in an intelligent way. So I have two numbers, num1 and num2. Not the greatest variable names, but right now their values are 4 and 3. They could be any value. They are not 4 and 3, they could be any value. I want to swap the values for num1 and num2. So after this example, num1 would be equal to 3, num2 would be equal to 4. But if the numbers were different, the numbers would change as well afterwards. I shouldn't have to know what num1 and num2 are, but I should be able to swap them. How can I swap two values? Notice I only have one equals sign at a time. I cannot equals two things at the same time, right? So how do I swap if I can only assign one thing? I can assign something to a variable. That's what this will do. It assigns this equals, will assign the value 3 to num2. How do I assign the value of 3 to num1, or the value whatever num2 is to num1? We know we can do this, but this will not necessarily help us. Num1 is equal to, we know we can do that. We can write that. But I can't, now that I've done that, I don't have num1 anymore. So how can I swap two variables? I want you to try that out for a second, then we'll actually go over an answer here. But so pause the video, try that out, think it through, and then we'll get back to it. Okay, now we're getting back to it. I hope you paused the video. So how could we go about doing this? Well, what I actually need is another integer. I thought this was so cool. Maybe I'm a nerd. Okay, I know I'm a nerd. Let's call it swap. And I'm going to set that value to num1. I'm going to make a new variable called swap, give it the value num1. I'm going to have, then I'm going to say num1 is equal to num2, like I had before. And then I can say num2, I should put consistent 2's, is equal to, oh, I didn't want this. And now I've swapped two numbers. I need an intermediary value in there. And it involves assigning variables, it involves new lines of code, it involves new variables, declaring new variables, and thinking through the problem in a methodical way. Because I can't just swap the values. There's no way of storing it somewhere else unless I explicitly make a place to store the value and then swap it. You can't just reverse numbers. It's not magic. It has to be step by step and algorithmic. All right, so I like that example. I'm going to take a quick pause. When we come back, we're going to go deep diving into functions, because functions are something that most other instructors cover later, but I like covering right away because they're so incredibly important to everything that we do later on. So when we come back, we'll look at functions and see why the main method doesn't have to be that big. Okay? Thanks very much, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.